Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Blue Smoke Podcast. This is the third episode of the podcast, and I hope you guys enjoy this one. Now, today's episode is actually going to be about retired steam excursion stars. I don't really have a reason for making this episode about this topic, I just kind of wanted to. And I actually have some thoughts on certain retired steam excursion locomotives. And yeah, I figured they're worth mentioning. Some locomotives are worth mentioning. Some I think should run again, and others I don't think need to run again. So recently I was actually watching a documentary about Reading 2101. It was by Jacob Western, and it was actually a pretty good documentary for, and a young filmmaker and someone who's still a little bit amateur. He actually did a really good job. And there were some editing choices that I was questioning, but it was a good documentary. You did a good job, Jacob, if you're listening to this. I loved in that documentary how the first part was all about Reading 2101, and then the second half was Jacob's personal connection to the locomotive. And it is interesting how that locomotive made him who he is, and how that is his favorite steam locomotive and just his personal connection to the locomotive. I don't really think I personally have a personal connection to any locomotives. I mean, well, there are locomotives, thinking about, yes, there are actually a couple, like Tweetsy's one I've always had a personal connection with, Tweetsy Railroad number 12, as I used to read a children's book about Tweetsy quite a bit. It was the Tweetsy Adventure book. I don't know if anyone who's listening has ever read that book. Let me know in the comments if you've read that book. I think I do have a bit of an attachment to 611, as that was one of my favorite steam locomotives growing up when it used to appear on I Love Toy Trains. So yes, there are some steam locomotives that I have personal attachments with, and I haven't even seen either of them in person yet. Hopefully it'll happen one day. Hopefully I'll get to see both of them under steam, operating very soon. But I figured since we're talking about this documentary, I guess the first excursion star I can bring up is Reading 2101. So Reading 2101's story, to me personally, it's not a sad story until you get to the end. There's sad parts in the story, but it's not really a sad story. The locomotive made so many accomplishments during its excursion career, since I think it pulled the longest train up the Allegheny Mountains, I'm pretty sure. By itself, no diesel assistance. And I want to say it almost ran out of water on 18 Mile Grade? Now I don't remember. But it's not really a sad story. It's a pretty happy story with a sad ending. But there are some sad parts in the story. I guess I'll tell the story of 2101. The locomotive was originally built as a 280 consolidation. Then during World War II, it was rebuilt into a 484 Northern. When diesels took over, Reading 2101 was saved for the Iron Horse Rambles, and it was kept as a spare engine, but never actually ran. After the end of the Iron Horse Rambles, 2101 and 2100 were sent to a scrapyard in Baltimore, Maryland, but they were held for preservation. And that's probably the saddest part of the story up until the ending. The locomotive was bought by Ross Rowland for the American Freedom Train, and it was restored in just 30 days. So that is a record in terms of steam restorations, as most rebuilds take only about 2 years. Once restored, 2101 pulled the eastern leg of the American Freedom Train, while Southern Pacific 4449 pulled the western portion of the American Freedom Train. Interestingly enough, though, 2101 ran through every eastern state except Georgia. 4449 covered the Georgia portion of the American Freedom Train, and that's the only eastern state 4449 ever ran through, and I think that's the farthest east 4449 has ever gone. I don't think 4449, it doesn't come out this far east very often. After the American Freedom Train, 2101 was brought in to pull the Chessie Steam Special, which I think it mostly ran around, I want to say Baltimore, Kentucky, Virginia, mostly around that portion of the US. Unfortunately, after the Chessie Steam special wrapped up, disaster struck the locomotive when the roundhouse it was being stored in, which was in Silver Grove, Kentucky, caught fire and severely damaged the locomotive. Afterwards, the locomotive was cosmetically restored and placed on static display at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum. The initial cosmetic restoration was actually a really good job, but as time's gone on, the locomotive has deteriorated from being out in the elements, and yes, the locomotive needs another cosmetic restoration. As far as operational restorations go, it would be nice to see it run again, but is there really anywhere to run it? Thinking about it, like, there's not really that much room for it to run at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum itself. I don't really know if they can get it on the main line, if whoever owns the tracks that connect to the B&O will allow it to run on the main line. And we are getting two Reading T1s under restoration right now, those being 2102 and 2100. I suppose I should bring up 2100 next because it has a much sadder story than Reading 2101, in my opinion. Although that story's kind of on a cliffhanger right now. Although, hopefully, it'll be running again soon. 2100 has the same backstory as 2101. It was originally a 280, then it got rebuilt into a Northern. Then it was put on the Iron Horse Rambles. However, unlike 2101, which never pulled the Rambles, 2100 actually did pull the Rambles. I think it replaced 2124 after 2124 was bought by F. Nelson Blount. After the end of the Rambles, it went to the same scrapyard as 2101, and like 2101, it was also purchased by Ross Rowland. However, Rowland never restored 2100 to operation. He used it as a parts engine for 2101, which is probably why the restoration on 2101 went so quickly, but that's also because they had a deadline to keep. After the American Freedom Train, 2100 was sold to Richard Kuhn, the owner and CEO of Lionel Trains, and he restored it to operation, and he ran it a little bit, but he didn't run it very much. Lionel's investors convinced him to sell the locomotive off. What followed was just basically years of the locomotive just being moved around a bunch. And at one point, the locomotive went to Hagerstown, Maryland, where it met up with 2101, which had been damaged in the Roundhouse fire at the time and was undergoing its cosmetic restoration. And the locomotive swapped tenders, which I find strange. I don't know if 2100's tender was in bad shape or whatever, but 2101's tender was the most damaged part of the whole locomotive when the fire happened because there was a full pile of coal in the tender, and that caught fire when the roundhouse went up, so that was the most damaged part of the whole locomotive. Then eventually the locomotive was purchased by Thomas Paine, and he took the locomotive up to Canada and converted it to oil firing. And a lot of people are very critical about this because, to be honest, I don't really know. Yes, the oil conversion was done poorly, but basically all the comments I read about 2100 is that, oh, this locomotive should be in Pennsylvania and burning coal. And he also had to add a bunch of aftermarket parts, including additional headlights, ditch lights. He painted the red stripes on the side of the locomotive and changed the tender to say Ferricuse, which I think is Latin for iron horse. And a lot of people complain about these cosmetic changes made to the locomotive, but I don't understand why they complain about them, considering 2101 went through 2 cosmetic changes, and no one complains about those. Heck, it's in American Freedom Train livery right now, and it has red stripes on the side. No one's complaining about that. Thomas Paine intended to run the locomotive in the Rocky Mountains. However, those excursion plans fell through, and eventually it wound up in Tacoma, Washington. And it had a short-lived excursion career there. I think it was only 2 months long. After that business went under, 2100 was steamed up for the final time and sent to some workshop or somewhere. It was stored somewhere for years until 2016 when it was bought by the American Steam Train Association, I think is what it's called. and now it is undergoing restoration to operating condition. Some thoughts about 2100. So I mentioned that a lot of people complain about the cosmetic changes made to the locomotive, claiming the red stripes looked stupid and everything. But its sister locomotive went through 2 cosmetic changes. It was bright yellow during one of those cosmetic changes, and no one complained then. And I actually kind of like the paint schemes on Reading 2101, for the record, but with 2100, I don't really like the cosmetic changes as much. But the big debate and point of discussion is the oil conversion. When I was first reading about it, I'd heard a lot of people were mad that the locomotive was converted to oil, and I had no idea why. Because, several other steam locomotives have been converted to burn oil, and no one complains then. But then after watching other videos and reading other stuff, I found out that the oil conversion was not done properly. 2100 is designed to burn anthracite coal, which means it has a really wide firebox, and I think it was being powered on a single oil burner that could barely cover the entire firebox. And as a result of that, the excursion train it was hauling was only 3 cars long, and it had a diesel, and the locomotive is barking down the line with it, and this is a big 484 Northern, and it shouldn't be struggling only pulling 3 cars. That's why the oil conversion is not well liked. There are other people who claim that the oil conversion kills its heritage, but that doesn't bother me as much, especially in this day and age when many steam locomotives that far west are being converted to burn oil. The Big Boy burns oil now, the 844 burns oil now. I'm trying to think about other locomotives that were converted. Just recently, the Durango and Silverton restored 493 and converted it to burn oil. And right now they're actually restoring 473 or overhauling 473, and they're converting that to burn oil too. So in this day and age, plenty of steam locomotives have been converted to burn oil, and it's been done successfully. Even the Big Boy was converted to burn oil successfully, and a lot of people have complained about the oil conversion on the Big Boy, but why are you complaining? If the Big Boy hadn't been converted to oil, I would have never been able to chase it in Arkansas, so I'm not complaining about that. However, with the restoration of 2100, the locomotive is being converted back to a coal burner, and hopefully very soon it'll be pulling excursions around Ohio. I have heard that the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad will take the locomotive in once it's ready for its Steam in the Valley events, so hopefully we'll see that run again. Who knows, maybe we'll get to see it with 765. I don't know, but hopefully we'll get to see that. Another retired steam excursion star that comes to mind very often, and I've got to bring this one up again. I've mentioned this in all 3 podcasts, and I don't mean to do it, but it's always worth bringing up. Cotton Belt 819. Cotton Belt 819 actually has, I don't know, it is kind of a sad story, but it may be on a cliffhanger right now, but I'm not really sure. I can't see 819 running again anytime soon, but we'll see. Maybe one day it will run again. But 819's story was it worked for the Cotton Belt. It was the very last steam locomotive built in the Cotton Belt shops, which is where it's on display today. After it was retired, it was put on display in a park in Pine Bluff. And there was only one rail fan who cared for the locomotive. I think his name was Mr. James Norris, I think was his name. He performed regular maintenance on the locomotive while it was on display. He would knock the bird nests off. Once a week, he would let the kids into the cab and ring the bell. However, eventually, Mr. Norris's health got too bad, and he eventually passed away, and with no one to care for the locomotive, it deteriorated rapidly. Between being out in the elements, even though it did have a shed, it was still out exposed to the elements. And then vandals started getting a hold of it. They stole so many parts off the locomotive. I remember seeing a photo of the locomotive after it was being pulled out of the park, and it looked bad. I've seen the photo online, but when I visited the museum, there was a huge portrait of the locomotive as it was being pulled out of the park. It looked awful. From what I heard, they actually, when it was being restored, they held basically this. The 819 crew would have this thing where if you wanted to return 819's parts, you could return them, no questions asked. And surprisingly, almost everything was returned except for its whistle, which they just got another cotton belt whistle, which I think it still wears today while it's on display in the shops. Then the locomotive ran excursions mostly from Pine Bluff to Tyler, and it took on its longest excursion when I don't remember exactly how far it went, but it went to the National Railroad Historical Society's annual convention, where it met 1218, Frisco 1522, and which will be two excursion stars I guess I'll talk about later, and Union Pacific 844. So it's interesting how that's the only locomotive of those four locomotives that still runs today. Then, after its final run in 1993, 819 went back to the Arkansas Railroad Museum, and they began a restoration on the locomotive. I talked about this on the previous podcast, but eventually, first there was a raise in insurance after an accident with an Amtrak locomotive, and then Union Pacific bought the line and banned 819. So, basically, 819, I'd say it lives a quiet retirement in the Arkansas Railroad Museum, although it is kind of a little too quiet. The Arkansas Railroad Museum apparently doesn't see very much. They don't see very many tourists. That's probably why it's a free museum. They don't really get enough to be able to charge. But the one thing that's actually really scary about this is recently the Arkansas Railroad Museum canceled their annual train show. And that was their big moneymaker. That's the only time of the year that they charge admission to get in. So that's kind of scary, in my opinion, that they canceled their big moneymaker. So I'm a little worried about that, but I don't know. We'll have to see what happens. I suppose since I mentioned 1218 and Frisco 1522 at the National Railroad Historical Society's annual convention, I guess I should talk about those two. And I've never seen either locomotive. I've had missed opportunities with both locomotives. I think 1218 has a shorter excursion career than 1522, so I guess I'll go over that first. Basically, it used to pull fast freight for the Norfolk and Western, fast heavy freight. Then it was retired and it was used as a stationary boiler at a factory or something like that. I don't remember for sure what it was used in, but it was used as a stationary boiler. Then it eventually went to Steamtown. I think it was, I don't remember if it was the Scranton location or the Vermont location. Probably the Vermont location. Then it was put on loan to the Virginia Museum of Transportation, and that resulted in a huge legal battle because eventually the Virginia Museum of Transportation decided that the locomotive was their property, and Norfolk Southern wanted to restore the locomotive. So they banned the locomotive being moved by rail back to Steamtown. And eventually the Virginia Museum of Transportation traded 2 diesels for 1218, which I think they still use today. Steamtown still does. And Norfolk Southern went ahead and began restoring 1218. The restoration was completed in 1989. 1218 operated for, I want to say, about 3 years. It had some pretty good excursions during that short time it was running, but in 1992 it was taken out of service for an overhaul, and while it was undergoing that overhaul, Norfolk Southern ended the steam program. So basically there was no reason to continue with the rebuild on 1218, so it was simply cosmetically restored and put on display at the Virginia Museum of Transportation, where it sits today. Personally, yes, I would like to see that one run again, but I don't think it's very likely. If most of its parts are missing, apparently, but I think most of its parts, though, are actually in possession of other companies or other private owners who basically, took the parts for their own use. Like, I think I remember I was at the Atlanta Botanical Gardens, and I was at the G scale train layouts. There's a video on my channel showing that. And I talked to this one guy who was working at the gardens, and we talked about trains. He mentioned that someone actually has one of 1218's pistons and uses it as a coffee table. So I remember I was so surprised when I heard that. I'm just like, that makes so much sense. That's where 1218's parts have gone. It's not that they were scrapped or anything. I think most of them just wound up in collections of private owners. So maybe if those can be returned, then maybe 1218 could run again. But as of right now, there's really nowhere to run it, considering it's a big locomotive. Norfolk Southern won't do steam excursions anymore. Amtrak won't do steam excursions anymore. And 611 can only get excursions right now on smaller railroads and heritage railroads. So really, there's nowhere to run 1218. And even when they had an opportunity to run it in the steam program, it didn't happen. So I don't think 1218 will ever run again. I'll never say never, but I don't think it will. That's my thoughts on that matter. And yeah, I had a close call. I remember driving through Roanoke, Virginia, but I didn't know 611 or 1218 were there. And this was before 611 was running again, and I had no idea they were there. And we drove through Roanoke. If I had known they were there, and apparently we drove right by the museum as well. If I had known they were there, I would have made my parents stop the car, and I would have gone to go see the locomotives. The frustrating thing about it is on that same trip, I went to the B&O Railroad Museum, and I ended up not seeing 2101 because I knew nothing about 2101 at the time. So, yeah, I had a lot of missed opportunities. Meanwhile, with Frisco 1522, it was just we drove through St. Louis. I knew it was there, but my family didn't feel like stopping for it, and I had already been to the Grand Canyon Railway, the Durango and Silverton, and the Forney Transportation Museum. So I had had plenty of train action that day, or just on that trip. But 1522 was, that locomotive pulled passenger trains for the Frisco. It was retired. I don't remember what year it was retired. Then I want to say it was the early 90s, maybe it was the late 80s. It was restored by, I don't actually remember the name, the 1522 Steam Group or something, the St. Louis Steam Association. It was something like that. And then the locomotive pulled excursions basically all over the place, honestly. I think it had some really good... It ran a couple excursions for the Southern Steam program. I remember it did a doubleheader to Atlanta with 611. And it's a shame I wasn't alive then, because I would have loved to have seen that. Although my dad claims he may have actually seen it. And, yeah, I'd love 611 to come back to Atlanta. But, yeah, 1522 is also known as the loudest steam locomotive in the world, just because its exhaust blasts that it gives when working hard. It's so loud that it made 611 sound like it was doing nothing when the two locomotives double-headed. However, in 2002, due to insurance issues, 1522 was retired, and now it's on display at the St. Louis Transportation Museum. That one I think definitely could run again one day when the time is right, and maybe if the insurance goes down. I doubt it ever will, but if the insurance goes down and someone is willing to run it again, I definitely think maybe 1522 could run again. But we'll see. It's in excellent condition from what I've heard. It's displayed indoors, so its cab is off limits, so I think the locomotive's pretty much intact. I definitely think it would be a good candidate for restoration if they ever were going to run it again. Of course, I can't talk about retired steam excursion stars without mentioning the two Jensen locomotives, which those being CB&Q 5632 and Grand Trunk Western 5629. Well, Jensen never operated 5632. 5632 operated in the CB&Q steam program, and after that ended, Richard Jensen bought the locomotive and he stored it in a roundhouse in Chicago. Eventually, there was a whole bunch of legal BS. I think the roundhouse changed owners. Jensen began moving parts out of the roundhouse and everything because I think he knew that his lease on the locomotive would not be renewed, or his lease on the roundhouse wouldn't. But he couldn't move the locomotive without it being inspected, and the roundhouse denied allowing an inspection, and eventually they towed the locomotive to a scrapyard for storage. But while it was being moved, the locomotive derailed, and since they had no way to re-rail it, the scrapyard just cut the locomotive up where she stood. Several years later, 5629 was operating excursions under Richard Jensen, and I think it even pulled the Ringling Brothers circus train at one point. However, Jensen ended up suffering a freak accident while helping someone move their fridge. The fridge ended up falling on him, which, poor guy. And because of medical bills, he couldn't afford to run excursions with the engine anymore. Eventually, I think he stored it in the Rock Island Yard. No, not the Rock Island Yard. The Blue Island Yard, I think is what it was called. And eventually, Metra bought that property, and they wanted to redesign the complex, but they couldn't move 5629 because it was owned by Jensen. They tried to get Jensen to move the locomotive, but they wouldn't provide any assistance in having it moved. I think Jensen ended up arguing with it. Eventually, there was a court order that if the locomotive was not moved, it could be scrapped. And I know the Illinois Railroad Museum tried to put up the money to get it moved, but Jensen was just refusing. He wouldn't back down. And I don't know, there was just all kinds of legal BS. And even then, I still don't understand everything that went on, like why it had to be scrapped, but it was also scrapped. So both of those stories have kind of sad endings. Two excursion stars I wish I could have seen when they were operational, unfortunately it was before my time, was Savannah and Atlanta 750 and Atlanta and West Point 290. And I saw 750 not too long ago on display at the Southeastern Railroad Museum. 290 is not available to see for the public. It's undergoing a cosmetic restoration. But like Cotton Belt 819, the Southeastern Railroad Museum is holding out on an opportunity to restore the locomotive for operational use. So who knows if that's ever going to happen? We'll see. But both locomotives pulled excursions for the New Georgia Railroad. Well, 750 was restored in the 80s, the 70s actually, and it was pulling excursions for the Southern Steam Program along with Southern 4501, Southern 630, and Southern 722. Then in the 80s, when the Southern no longer needed it, it went to the New Georgia Railroad, and it began pulling excursions for that. Then in the late 80s, the locomotive was taken offline because it needed firebox repairs, which were deemed too expensive. So it was put on display at the Southeastern Railroad Museum, where it still is today. 290 was called in as a replacement. It was restored in the early 90s. I want to say it was 1990, maybe 91. And it only pulled excursions for about 2 years before the New Georgia Railroad had its funding discontinued by the state government. So eventually that led to 290's retirement, and now it's undergoing a cosmetic restoration. And operational restoration is being considered, but there's no opportunities to run it right now. So that's probably why the cosmetic restoration is on hold. Since I mentioned Southern 722, I suppose I should mention that one. And that one was, I think, restored a couple years after 630 was restored. So late 70s, maybe the early 80s. It pulled excursions for the Southern Steam Program. It wore the Southern Passenger Green, while its sister 630 was left in freight black. And eventually, after it was retired by the steam program for larger power, and it ran excursions at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum, but it was retired in 87, 88. It was retired before 630 because of like firebox issues and problems like that. And Norfolk Southern, who still owned the locomotive, moved it around. At one point, it was moved to Asheville, North Carolina, and it was put on display there. Eventually, it was bought by the Great Smoky Mountains Railroad, or it was donated to the Great Smoky Mountains Railroad. What I think happened was the railroad got 722 to replace 1702, which at the time was nearing an expiration on the flue time, and it was going to need an overhaul. So they got 722 in order to replace 1702, and since 722 was bigger and it was, historic to the line, they figured, oh, that'd be perfect. We've got a historically accurate locomotive and it's bigger. It should be able to pull bigger trains than 1702. It's perfect. However, when they dismantled 722, I think they realized that the rebuild was going to cost over $1 million from what I've heard. So I think after that, they decided, okay, we'll just restore 1702 instead. 1702 was retired in 2004, and it was discovered that restoration was going to cost $250,000. So both locomotives sat outside, completely dismantled, out in the elements for several years. But now 1702 is operational again, thanks to the county, the Swain County. But 722 is still dismantled outside the Dillsboro shops. So who knows if 722 will ever run again? I think it will run again. I think it will run again one day, and but we'll see what happens. You never know. The last steam excursion star I'm going to bring up, and this is going to be the last one I'm going to talk about for today's podcast. This one is actually very important to me because I think it was the first steam locomotive I ever rode. Well, it was the first steam locomotive I ever rode was the live steam Thomas at the Day Out with Thomas. But the first non-Thomas steam locomotive I ever rode was Tennessee Valley Railroad 610. And that locomotive, I remember I rode it twice. And it was retired in 2010 after it busted a water injector. And recently the locomotive was evaluated for restoration, but I don't think the restoration's happening because the locomotive's sitting back in the storage barn. And I think since 630's flue time is running low, and I think this year is going to be the last year for 630 before overhaul. I think the museum plans to just overhaul 630. So it could be a while before we see 610. But yeah, I had two experiences riding 610. Both scared me. But I think what scared me about 610 was that Illinois Central 3-chime whistle it was wearing. Because that whistle's kind of scary. It's that deep, it's that really deep steamboat whistle. I know 630's worn it a couple of times since then, but 630 these days usually wears the Central of Georgia 6-chime. But yeah, 610 wore that Illinois Central the 2 times I rode her. And yeah, that thing was scary. I also remember 610 actually having the nickname Tinkerbell, but I've never heard anyone else call it that. Just at the museum, there was one tour guide who called it Tinkerbell. I've never heard anyone else call it that. So that about wraps up today's episode of the Blue Smoke Podcast. Let me know what topics you'd like to hear about in upcoming podcasts. And this is Blue Smoke Productions saying goodbye and thank you for listening.